we have the whole schedule for the semester on these flyers here. In any case, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Carlos Sanchez here to the University of Colorado, Denver. I met him through the Society for Philosophy in the Contemporary World, where he's presented a number of times. And he's currently Associate Professor of Philosophy at San Jose State University. He also, this coming year, will have a visitor scholar position at Stanford. He is author of a couple books, one on Husserl from a couple years back, and this year a book titled The Suspension of Seriousness, Phenomenology of Jorge Portilla. So Agnes wants to join us too. So.
I'm cracking it so I can hear.
So please join me in welcoming Professor Sanchez.
Thank you for having me very much. So this paper is part of a series of papers that I've written over the last few years on immigration, and I'm discussing immigration in a different way. I think I'm doing what I call a phenomenology, but it's really my own version of it. And so this one is kind of takes off from the paper that I gave earlier today, and it's on immigrant narratives, phenomenology, and beyond. That's what I call it. So I'll just go ahead and start. Introduction. Because the acts which constitute the phenomenon of immigration involve the movement of human beings across recognized state boundaries, immigration is thought to be an essentially political phenomenon. As such, the philosophical consideration of immigration has been largely aimed at a thorough deconstruction of this essence, namely a calculated reflection into its political aspect. The most prominent approaches, such as the conventional view or the open borders position, take as their starting point the fundamental right of states to regulate entry, and go on to argue that either the state has a right to strongly regulate admissions based on national priorities, like Michael Walzer, or that the state has an obligation to open its borders to immigrants based on, quote, liberal egalitarian ideas, including freedom, equal opportunity, and moral equality, unquote. That's from Joseph Cairns. Other less prominent views assume that Westphalian view that states have a right to control admission, but argue that states should either welcome the foreigner in a show of cosmopolitan hospitality a la Kant, or that the foreigner should be welcome in an effort to redress injustices such as poverty and human rights violations, which the state has caused in the process of becoming the state to which everyone wants to migrate. Thus, when philosophers reflect on the phenomenon of immigration, they usually do it within the conceptual and methodological parameters of a liberal or neoliberal social and political philosophy, particularly obsessed with state sovereignty, or with the rights and obligations of the state versus the rights and obligations of the non-citizen, or to non-citizens. Indeed, the difference between migration and immigration rests on the fact that immigration is simply human migration that infringes on state sovereignty. The value of these philosophical approaches is that they usually prescribe ethical and legal approaches to the issue, meanwhile cataloging the main points of debate, for instance, the priority of the right of nations versus the freedom of movement and association, integration versus assimilation, and the sanctity of law versus the struggle for survival. As I see it, the current philosophical discussion of immigration tends to treat all immigrants alike, favoring philosophy's ideological dictum to achieve universality at all costs. That is, what these philosophical accounts leave out is the concrete or real experience of immigration. In what follows, I focus less on the political confrontation between immigrants and state sovereignty, and thus less on the ethical and legal ramifications of immigration, and more on the real immigrant experience itself. My aim is a phenomenology of immigration, where I look at immigration as a situated lived experience. The phenomenological approach serves as a point of departure for a critique of current attitudes regarding immigrants that depend on established dogma regarding state sovereignty, citizenship, and the force of anti-immigration rhetoric, rather than on the reality of the immigrant experience itself, a reality revealed in what I call immigrant narratives. The following talk is divided into 3 sections. I like threes for some reason. In the first section, I lay out the phenomenological approach I will be taking. Here I appeal to Edmund Husserl's concept of empathy as a useful yet insufficient starting point. In the second section, I consider what I see as a primary given of the immigrant experience, or that phenomena that points to the situated reality of that experience, namely the immigrant narrative. Loosely borrowing from Paul Ricoeur, I emphasize personal narrative as that which, quote, leads back to life, unquote, to a concrete and real human experience. It is my view that immigrant stories, or personal narratives, have the power to break through those barriers to clarity and compassion created by objectification and reification. On that note, the third and final section argues for the value of the immigrant experience to the lives of citizens, and here U.S. citizens, who by historical accident stand in the position to perfect their humanity through acts of listening and compassion. Put differently, I suggest that immigrant narratives reveal the limits and possibilities of citizenship by revealing its other. Okay, part 1, Phenomenology. The aim of phenomenology of the immigrant experience would be to raise to the level of reflective consciousness some of the essential aspects of this kind of life. There are 2 approaches one can take to accomplish such a phenomenology. The first approach, or on the one hand, if one is an immigrant, one can speak about his or her experience from the first person perspective, thus highlighting the intuitions, intentions, values, beliefs, etc., that are specific to that kind of experience. On the other hand, if one is not an immigrant, one can look at the experience of immigrants themselves, objectively and without prejudice, and describe their values, beliefs, intentions, etc. on the basis of what Edmund Husserl called a perception or empathy, in which the existence of another ego is made present to me via a non-originary pairing or analogy of the other's bodily behavior with mine. Or as Husserl puts it in his Cartesian Meditations, in my intentionality, this is quote Husserl, in my intentionality there becomes constituted an ego, not as I myself, but as mirror in my own ego, in my monad. The second ego, however, is not simply there and strictly presented. Rather, he is constituted as alter ego, the ego indicated as one moment by this expression being I, myself, and my ownness. The other, according to his own constituted sense, points to me, myself. The other is a mirroring of my own self, and yet not a mirroring proper, an analog of my own self, yet again not an analog in the usual sense, unquote. Put differently, or stated differently, from a Husserlian phenomenological standpoint, the other who stands before me is constituted or created by me as an alter ego, one who looks and acts like me, but who is not me, and who in his own doings and intendings points to me myself. Of course, this does not mean that I create the other as a phantom of my imagination or of my desires, but rather that I give this other the sense of a foreign subjectivity, or a non-I. The point of saying that I give the other sense is then to return to my own consciousness and examine my sense-giving acts and thus reveal the true, objective meaning of otherness. Only when dealing with those mirror images of myself can I speak of empathy as that sense-giving act that constitutes an I. Husserl's phenomenology aims at scientific objectivity, but our inability to enter the skull of the observed and read her concrete, real, existentially motivated intentions makes the science unverifiable. No matter how scrupulous I am in analyzing my sense-giving acts, I can in no way know for certain that the other is just like me, or even that empathy reveals anything at all about the other there before me. So right off the bat, an objective scientific picture of the immigrant experience seems closed to us, especially because the so-called analogy would be between 2 very different experiences. However, Husserl also emphasizes the priority of the first-person standpoint to deliver the essence of experience. It is from my own perspective, that is, that I can uncover the essential structures of consciousness. Hence, a phenomenology of the immigrant experience that begins from the first-person account of this experience seems, for now, to be the most fruitful. This, even if the first-person description of a lived experience is subjective and thus defies any attempt for scientific verification, making any result, Richard Rorty would say, merely poetic articulations. A phenomenology of the immigrant experience is thus not Husserlian. A phenomenology of the immigrant experience is grounded and revealed in narrative, in stories and first-person accounts. A phenomenology that takes the immigrant experience as revealed in narrative is more in line with that of Paul Ricoeur and Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas, for instance, criticizes Husserl's notion of empathy, calling it an instance of, quote, the imperialism of the same, unquote. This knowledge by analogy is impossible when the other is fundamentally different than I, or when I cannot know to what extent that other is the same as I. Levinas proposes that we attend instead to what the other says. Quote, the world is offered in the language of the other. It is born by propositions. Unquote. In this way, a phenomenology of the immigrant experience is a phenomenology of otherness, or better yet, the phenomenology of others who confront and speak to me. As such, it tries to make sense of the experience of others, of that self out there which is different from the self in here. The attempt to fully make sense of that otherness, however, will always fall short, as that otherness is a radical difference that does not allow itself to be objectified or totalized. Levinas' prescription is thus to welcome the other and respect his or her presence or absence, as the other does not give him or herself away. I follow Levinas' cue only to the extent that I argue for the impossibility of totalizing the immigrant experience, but I stop short of adopting the radical ethics that he proposes, whereby I must give myself away in the presence of the other as an act of generosity and welcome. With that said, in this essay I suggest that the phenomenology of the immigrant experience will be a phenomenology of subjectivity that, in its otherness, narrates its difference and is made present by reactions to this narration, by the violence of loss or the acts of acceptance it inspires. Part 2, narrative. As a son of undocumented or illegal immigrant parents, my formative years were lived under the constant threat of deportation. Not knowing any better at the time, I came to believe that the ever-present fear in which we lived had something to do with us personally, as a family, that we had done something unforgivable, that the green trucks were after us. My father told me that we were illegal, and so I grew up thinking of myself as a criminal, that my very presence was a violation of the law. The daily immigration raids on farms where my parents worked were a constant reminder of our bare and criminal existence. Although I was a citizen, I nonetheless lived the immigrant life, and until much later on, realized that not everyone did. Once I left my immigrant community, I soon realized that while others, liberal or conservative, acknowledged the existence of immigrants in general, those not directly engaged with that community could not imagine the existence of immigrants in particular, or the concrete immigrant experience. Not everyone, that is, could imagine that a 10-year-old boy could think that his very existence was a violation of the law. While the existence of immigrants in general can be easily gathered from anti-immigrant sentiments and the laws that justify those sentiments, the existence of immigrants in particular requires a confrontation with something else, a different kind of giveness or evidence, namely the presence and reality of the immigrant narrative. According to Paul Ricoeur, life is, quote, an activity and a desire in search of a narrative, unquote. The narrative of life's desires is its own. We desire the story of our own lives, that is, the text of our becoming. So we live to narrate and narrate to live, and narrate as we live. Narratives are then stories people tell themselves and ultimately tell each other. My own story is an attempt to understand myself as a continually reinterpreting entity unfolding in history. In this way, self-understanding comes from reading myself correctly. But self-understanding also comes from reading texts offered to us from elsewhere, namely literary texts and stories of other lives. Ricoeur writes, quote, a life examined, in the sense borrowed from Socrates, is a life narrated, unquote. To say that I am text and that others are text is also to say that I am a reader. And according to Ricoeur, reading transforms the reader in the very act. Quote, thus the act of reading becomes a crucial moment of the entire analysis. On this act rests the ability of the story to transfigure the experience of the reader, unquote. The reader of text is changed when he reads. The experience of the narrative opens up new vistas, which alter my previous state of being and understanding. As he puts it, quote, a text is not an entity closed in upon itself, it is a projection of a new universe, different from the one in which we live, unquote. Ricoeur is here talking primarily of literary texts, but I think the same can be said of personal narratives, which are in fact projections of new universes that Husserl's empathy could otherwise never reach. Immigrant stories are texts that invite the reader to contemplate a different universe, one closed off to non-immigrants, for social, political, or merely psychological reasons. This world is a world of danger and death, indignities, racism, hatred, resiliency, and the entrepreneurial spirit born of necessity and fear. But it is a universe tied to the destiny of our own, namely of the citizen. The universe of the non-immigrant citizen realizes its limits and its possibilities when it confronts a borderline that the non-citizen immigrant cannot cross. The borderline, a limit, revealed in the textual configurations of the immigrant's narrative. The non-citizen immigrant's narrative gives form to what could be an impoverished, handicapped, and unformed image of a being and a way of life encountered and talked about on an everyday basis in many North American cities. Narratives are thus stories that form and shape a life otherwise anonymous. Ricord says that they lead back to life, to an unfolding and becoming that is real and human. The suggestion is that narratives instruct us, giving shape to our own unfolding, making us better human beings in the process, or allowing us to fulfill our potential. When instead of subjugating the immigrant other to the laws of the land, to the demands of capital, to the perceived consequences of their own choices, we attend to her story, then, I argue, we enrich our own existence by accomplishing, at least minimally, the promise of our own privileged situation as fully righted citizens. As the immigrant appears and moves about, questions the non-immigrant's place in the social space, and makes possible the consciousness of a non-immigrant difference through her difference, or her lack of sameness, she reveals her humanity in personal stories of longing and overcoming, of necessity and invention, or stories that explain why they have risked life and limb to be where they are not wanted. In those stories, she tells us that she is here, that she is present. Ultimately, what is said is important because it points to the certainty of that experience, namely that it is there, in the world, as a fact, and not as a generalization with the power to destroy our welfare system or our economy. Attending to what is said, to the subjective discourse of immigrants, also reveals that the immigrant experience requires a response, that it requires resistance or compassion, struggle or understanding. It is from the starting point of attending to these narratives or stories, and not from attending to an idealized and objectified version of immigrants, that one should begin to deal with. The kinds of narratives that I have in mind that can shape our own self-understanding, even though they come from another, that can shape our conception of citizenship and nationhood, are personal narratives like my father's, who immigrated to the U.S. in the late 1960s. More than speaking of trial, tribulation, resiliency, determination, adaptation, courage, and longing, these narratives also reveal paradoxes and absurdities. My father was and is a reluctant immigrant. He did not risk life and limb in search of a better life or in search of an American dream. My father tempted death and the law in search for a way to return back to his origin, to the place of his birth. He left so as to return. He and his compatriots knew that the better life promised in media narratives and other idealizations could not be had by them, that it was merely an idea, one invented to feed America's ego by the proud voice of American exceptionalism. So he came to the U.S. to make enough money to be able to return to his land and his family. Of course, the paradox in which he found himself was that once here he could not return, since without his financial support his land would dry up and his family would starve to death. In other words, in an effort to escape the misery of their condition in a country ravaged by decades of government corruption and the self-serving nature of both Mexican and American foreign policy, reluctant immigrants like my father created dependency relations that made it impossible to return home. Hence the fearlessness in which some undocumented immigrants repeatedly violate American sovereignty, they cannot risk not to. Their dignity, tied as it is to their hometowns and their families, depends on taking these risks. He expressed the paradoxical nature of his situation to me once, very poetically saying, "When my feet crossed the border, my heart returned home, and I stayed on the line where I remained." Philosophical orthodoxy would have us reject these stories, these narratives, due to their specificity, as subjective articulations of the immigrant experience, a sort of testimony that has no real verifiable content. But if we want to make contact with the most visceral aspects of human existence, or with the most uncomfortable aspects of our own, we must attend to these stories. The immigrant narrative constitutes a wholly different human experience, despite what media spectacle might add to the overall picture. What the spectacle accomplishes is that it kneads these subjective sayings into the generic mantras that define public discourse. What individuals say is obscured or forgotten or eclipsed by the narrative object. The narrative object, created as it is by the mashing up of voices in the machine of spectacle, portrays the immigrant as saying that he wants the American dream at any cost. This can only mean that the immigrant will do what it takes to take what belongs to law-abiding citizens. In this way, as potential threats, the voiceless strangers, as George Simmel noted, are also dangerous presences easily transmuted into scapegoats when the community feels threatened. An example of this is not hard to find. Take former presidential candidate Herman Cain, who called for drastic measures to protect the American way of life. Namely, he called for the creation, quote, of a 20-foot wall, barbed wire electrified on the top, and on this side of the fence, I'll have a moat. And I would put alligators in that moat. At best, this cartoonish version of a solution to a human problem assumes that there are no humans involved. At worst, it assumes that those humans are dispensable. This assumption again is rooted in an objectified view of the immigrant body and of the immigrant himself. My view is that subjective narrative humanizes these strangers. It turns them into neighbors or guests, sufferers or survivors, rather than threats to a way of life and a national destiny. In the Euthydemus, Plato has Socrates say, quote, "We must allow the stranger to use language in their own way, and not quarrel with them about words, but be thankful for what they give us," unquote. Socrates seems to suggest that the stranger's story is one that can make us better citizens, so one must not quarrel with her, but rather thank her for the gift. In my father's example, his gift is precisely the revelation of the paradoxical nature of his own experience, which has him trapped in an impossible return home. What he gives as gift is an opportunity for citizens who would otherwise not think about their citizenship to value it as something that they cannot abandon in an effort to save it. But his gift is also an enriching story that contributes to our understanding of how America is constituted as a nation. Or at least what this gift gives is a glimpse of a foreign universe, one usually closed off to citizens in the global elite. To attend to individual immigrant stories is to exhibit an openness required for what Celia Ben-Habib has called egalitarian reciprocity, a precondition of humane and respectful conversation. But it also means to welcome the possibility of a story that can expand and deepen my own cosmopolitan aspirations. Or as Richard Rorty puts it, quote, "Our nation is to be achieved not by inquiry but by imagination, the imaginative ability to see strange people as fellow sufferers," unquote. The immigrant narrative is a telling of a specific human experience of suffering and overcoming. To attend to it is to open ourselves to the possibility of a compassion, and in seeing these strangers amongst us as fellow sufferers, thus to achieve our democratic aspirations. My own immigrant story, which I had here before, but I took it out, which has me living in the shadow of my parents' immigrant suffering, is evidence of this human phenomenon. But it is also what I give to you. It is a gift. The gift of the immigrant experience is rejected and annulled by our closing of our doors, by calling her illegal and denying her human rights, by placing her outside the space of civility and humanity. But simultaneously, we are closing ourselves off to growth and progress. Part 3, the consequences of listening beyond phenomenology. Richard Rorty repeatedly suggested that the days of once and for all visions of the good life were over, and with that the days of moral imperatives that can withstand the test of time. In our age and in our country, one constituted by what he called postmodern bourgeois liberalism, we have certain responsibilities to protect our interests, including our traditions, our democracy, and the fabric of our citizenship. To some, this of course means that postmodern bourgeois liberals, that is, North American citizens, or those living in the developed West, have to confront and resist the immigrant from a sense of responsibility to protect the integrity of a certain way of life. For Rorty, however, this does not mean that the stranger who comes to our door, by either the push or pull of circumstance, must be treated as nothing less than an equal. Quote, "On my view, a child wandering the woods, the remnant of a slaughtered nation whose temples have been razed and whose books have been burned, has no share in human dignity. This is indeed a consequence of my view, but it does not follow that she may be treated like an animal. For it is part of the tradition of our community that the human stranger from whom all dignity has been stripped is to be taken in, to be reclothed with dignity," unquote. Rorty's sentiment that part of the tradition of our community is to take in the stranger is echoed by those who argue that we are a country founded and created by immigrants, and hence that our resistance to immigration is hypocritical. But there is more to Rorty's call for care and compassion here. Immigrants, especially illegal immigrants, are very much like lost children wandering the woods after the slaughtering of their nations and the razing of their temples. While some come from war-torn countries, fleeing violent revolutions, civil wars, or coups, thus from literally witnessing the slaughtering of their nations, many come from places where the slaughter is more symbolic, having taken place in the slaughter bench of globalization, at the hands of modernity, or in the midst of other economic catastrophes that these might have brought about. In Mexico, for example, the North America Free Trade Agreement destroyed a farmer's ability to make a living growing corn, a crop of vital necessity to the survival of a way of life for thousands of years. This symbolic raising of the temple of Cien-Toro, the Aztec god of maize, brought many immigrants to the U.S. after 1994. There's of course more to the notion that we as citizens are responsible for reclothing the immigrant to human dignity. When we strip the stranger's dignity due to ideological prejudices rooted in the mythologies of nationalism and patriotism, we also take away the possibility of her death, and with this the possibility that she can suffer, that she can demand our sympathy and our understanding. Generic entities cannot die, so to reclothe the immigrant means that he must first be made concrete. To do this, it must be assumed that the immigrant body itself is just as fragile as any other body, that it dies of electrocution if an irrigation pipe comes in contact with an electric wire, that it dies from head trauma when it slips from a tractor on a dew-soaked morning and slams itself against the plow, that it dies if starved or dehydrated, that it dies from cancer. The move away from generic understanding of the immigrant body and the immigrant experience sounds ethically right, but for some it might not be practical or prudent. It will be prudent or practical, however, if the immigrant has something palpable to offer those in a position to care and offer their compassion. I have been suggesting that the immigrant experience does have something to offer, namely a story that can enrich a listener, that can make one a better citizen and ultimately a better human being. Max Shaler, in his Sociology of Knowledge, reflects on the consequences of state power when that power reaches beyond its borders and consumes its neighbors. When this happens, a positive end is that, quote, the collective knowledge about the world increases with the increased opportunity for cultural, productive, mutual contacts, unquote. The continued marginalization of immigrants in the media or through law is ultimately only hurting our chances of increasing our knowledge about the world and ourselves, and this is certainly tragic for us postmodern bourgeois liberals. Conclusion. Immigrants speak, and in that speaking they tell us who they are. There is no meta-narrative that can capture the immigrant experience. There are specific stories and accounts that brought together might share some common characteristics, but the essence of the experience cannot be extracted. Here then phenomenology fails, if its purpose, as Husserl demanded, is to capture the essence of the given. Then it falls short when it comes to this particular givenness. Nevertheless, we can attend to those narratives that come to us with respect and humility. They are given as gifts. Ultimately, the unavailability of an essence that can allow for the totalization of the immigrant experience makes it possible to propose an approach to that experience that is neither moral nor ethical, but prudent. This approach is rooted in the notion that the immigrant experience is allowed to teach us. It is possible that by resisting the temptation to know the immigrant through her body and by attending to the subjective narrative of her experience, we, as citizens of the U.S. and of the planet, can become better and more complete human beings. The stranger is the source of our growth. The phenomenology of the immigrant experience reveals that the giveness of that experience is both complex and, if we are not careful, easily objectified. It is easily objectified as strange and foreign and paradoxically as a colonizing force that, moved by perceivable and recognizable bodies, violates the sanctity of borders in order to violate and replace American life with something inferior and strange. Its complexity is not perceivable until one attends to the nature of that embodiment and to the specific modes of giveness of that experience that do not give everything away, namely the immigrant narrative, which particularizes the immigrant and returns her to the realm of the concrete, separating her, by the very nature of the narrative, from the abstractness which fuels objectification and prejudice. Thank you.
So we have time for question and answer. I wanted to ask you about language differences, because the greater number of undocumented immigrants that I've met are Canadian, and so it's a funny image of the illegal that we typically have it in this country when in fact it's not necessarily Mexican immigrants that fall in that category, and yet but there is this issue though of language, a divide in terms of language. That I wonder how it relates to this question of being able to communicate with and actually hear the other, so as to form community that way.
Right. Yeah, I thought a lot about that. I couldn't really. The only thing that I came up with when I was thinking about this is something that I mentioned in the other talk, is that it is up to us, right, to tell those stories. In cases like that. So for instance, I go around the country telling the stories of my dad. I'm always talking about my father. And I tell these different stories about, him coming here and getting thrown back, and coming back and getting thrown back, and coming back because he wanted to go back, stuff like that. And to me, that's a telling of a narrative. Of course, it would be more efficient if you knew how to speak English and you could tell your stories yourself. But I think that you're right. That language is a big barrier, and it's up to us post-immigrants, as I refer to children of immigrants who are citizens or who speak the language, to tell those stories. For now, we don't want to get into a situation where we're telling the wrong story or telling the story incorrectly.
I wonder if there are other, sorry, just in line with these other barriers too. That and I'm just curious to hear what you think about this, because the idea of the narrative experience. When you think about like books, right? We have freedom with respect to books, right? I can pick up this book, start reading it, whatever. I don't like police detective novels. I'm going to take this and there's a lot of choice and freedom, and I can choose what narratives I pay attention to and which ones I don't.
Right.
And perhaps one of the barriers too is that there are narratives that I tell myself about what type of reader I am. Yeah, what types of things I like, right? And I'm convinced about those, and that means I don't pay attention to a lot of stuff that I don't really care about.
Right.
So one is not just a language barrier, but there's a kind of narrative barrier about like the people who have a particular conception of what human being. Because I can be very compassionate about people who have struggled and all that stuff, but I can also have a narrative about how people should take themselves up, pick themselves up from their own bootstraps and stuff like that. And I'm a person who believes that freedom means I can do whatever I want with no help, with all that stuff. And if I have that narrative, it doesn't matter what story you're going to tell me. I'm not going to be sympathetic or pay attention to it in the way one might hope you would pay attention to it. And the obstacle is I have a particular conception of what such stuff I like to read, right? And I can't get rid of that. You're telling me your story is not going to make me get rid of that. And so how do we tap into that problem?
Well, here's the thing with that. Like I don't think that everybody should get up and go looking for immigrants.
Right.
That'd be scary. Right? If all of a sudden you think, you know what, my life is going to be enriched if I talk to one of these immigrants. I want to go look for one. Right? And then you run down the street and start shaking people and asking them to tell your story. I don't think that's the case. I think where I'm going with all this is this idea that if you're going to objectify the immigrants, right? If you're in a situation where your option is to objectify these people, that's a situation in which you must listen to the narrative. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I guess I could not objectify you, right? I could just be like, well, no, you're a human being. I understand your struggles, but you know what? You should not have left because independent people, we can pull ourselves out of any problem, even if they took away your land or the treaty screwed up all your corn, farms and all that stuff. You can do other stuff. You can be, you can be your own man. You can. So all this story you're telling me, I don't want to hear about it. I'm not objectifying you. I understand your plight, whatever, but you should not have come, right? I can have the same kind of like crazy story.
But then what you're doing is that you're having a conversation with another person.
Oh.
You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
And so the idea is, we can sit here and like I can even do this. I completely objectify the immigrant experience,
Mm-hmm.
right? And tell you, they come in search of a better life, which is not necessarily true. Right? They come in search for a better life, and they have to face all these troubles. They do all these things. But they're taking our jobs, and they should go back to their country. Right? Now that's an instance in which I'm not talking about a person. Right? I'm talking about an idea, like and part of the spectacle. Right? I'm talking about this image. Now, my suggestion is that if that's what you're doing, right, then yeah, go out into the street and find one and talk to them and see what story they tell you. And when you're facing them right there, then tell them, why did you leave? You shouldn't have left, right? You should have stuck it through and figured something else out. Corn is not the only crop, you could have turnips. Right? And then, brush them off and go on your way. But you're dealing with them as people at that moment, And I guess that's where I'm going with all of this. I don't know if I'm getting there, but that's where I'm going. That's what I'm heading. Yes.
So is the objectification process that you speak of, do you think that's rooted more in the more racist element of, because like we said, when you're Canadian, it's not as big a deal. But do you think it's more as a racism thing, or do you think it's more of the illegality and the practical aspect of it?
Both, right? I mean, Leo Chavez, the sociologist from, I forget, UC Davis? No, Irvine. He says, illegality is written upon the body of the immigrant. And I take that to mean that race is racial.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the way that we perceive immigrants is racial.
Mm-hmm.
And where I live in San Jose, we have a humongous Vietnamese population, right? It's the biggest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam, in San Jose, in East San Jose. Now in East San Jose, you have two different groups that live together, right? It's the Mexicans, or Central Americans, and the Vietnamese, right? And they kind of share the east side. Now, when you hear a story about, there was an immigration, an ICE raid on so and so, it's Mexicans, right? They're going after Mexicans. They're not going after the Vietnamese. They're going after the Mexicans because they're the illegal ones, right? So and then a town above, a couple of miles away from San Jose, Fremont. The majority of the population there is Indian. Indian, and then another town is Filipino. Now, it would be absurd to think that they're legal here. It would be dumb for me to think that. But if the U.S. ICE agents decide one day to go and round up some immigrants, they're not going to go after the Indians. They're not going to go after the Vietnamese because they're looking for a particular kind of person. So to me, it's race is at the heart of this situation and this objectification.
I have a question about that objectification stuff too. So I was kind of fixating on when you were saying that these immigrant narratives, that part of the value of them, I thought, was that because of their particularity, that they resist the sort of objectified general statement that everyone's here for the American
Right.
dream and to take away all our good American jobs. Is there something specific about immigration that makes that unobjectifiable, though, or is that something you could say for sort of any person's story, or is there? What is it? So I'm just wondering, what's the specific thing here that's resisting objectification, or is it the case that this is a case? Is immigration simply a case where we want to objectify it more than we would in other cases, or what's the specificity?
Yeah. Well, I think that the specificity comes in talking to this person, right, and the specific act of conversation that takes place between yourself and someone, right? Because I mean, the reality is that a lot of, if you put a lot of legal immigrants in a room, and you ask them why they came here, they might tell you the same exact story, and therefore you have this kind of general picture as to why this particular group came. But they're not all the same story, and so, to me at least, the specificity comes when you're talking to this particular person. And so it's impossible, I think, to not generalize. But I think you're right in the sense that we kind of want to in this particular case.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, like, you could sort of say the same thing about, like, my life. I grew up in the suburbs, and then I went to school, and then I went to more school and got a job, end of story. I mean, but then there's also the specificity of, you know, whatever, not particularly interesting specificity, but is sort of like my story more easily objectified than the immigrants? Or, you know, or
Yeah.
are they sort of, are they all specific, so there's really no objective story about anyone's life, or?
Well, I
you know?
you know, ultimately, and I'm gonna say this without any proof or argument, ultimately is I think we want, or like we, I mean, the postmodern bourgeois liberals, need to objectify the immigrants out of a sense of shame. This idea that if you look at the history of immigration over the last century, it has been a case of a supply and demand situation, right, where, you know, we welcome them when we really need them, right? And then we kick them out when we don't. We welcome them when we need them, and kick them out when they're not useful. And it keeps going. It's been going forever. And especially in the United States, and I think that, you know, there's this sense of guilt and shame that goes along with the way that we've treated these others, to the point that generalizing them might make us feel better. You know?
And a specific generalized story too, right?
Yeah, right. And then, you know, like I talked about in the previous talk, I talked about this notion of illegality, right? The illegal. That word illegal is very powerful in the process of objectifying the immigrants, you know, because it allows us to do it without shame. Because if they're illegal, that means that, well, you broke the law, right? And if you're not part of this lawful space, so I can treat you the way any way I want. I'm not arguing that here, but I think I should.
So do you think that the solution, therefore, is to start with the legality of it? Because it seems like because at first I was thinking the objectification leads to the status of illegal. But then I'm thinking, after you just said that you would have to start with changing the laws to make the status of illegal taken off the table, and then we can work towards getting rid of the objectification.
That's what I said briefly in the previous talk, I think. Yeah, so, I mean, it's a very hard process, you know, I'm not naive. I think that it might not change in my lifetime or even yours, but, because, you know, I think, you know, we need illegals. You know, we need the illegal element in our midst, because it reflects the limits of our own possibility as citizens. And we see that, you know, as I put it somewhere else, you know, beyond the illegal immigrant, there's nothing. And there's a limit. That's what, you know, that's where it stops. And so we kind of need to call them illegal too, you know, because for some reason it makes us feel better the way we're going to treat them. And you know, I can't convince anybody not to be racist or xenophobe or nativist. You know, I can't do that. Just talk. Tell you stories about my dad. Yeah.
I have a question for you about the narrative function and the in the way that the undocumented student activists are using their stories.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And what I mean, obviously there's a political dimension there, and the whole notion of testimony, like first person political narrative.
Right.
And so what is your sense, given what you've talked about the narrative function here, of how the students are appropriating that narrative function to talk about the immigrant experience?
I think that's the right way to go, right? Particular stories are very powerful, and I think that's the right approach. I sit on the board of directors of this organization called the Center for Employment Training in San Jose. And basically what we do is that, or the way that it started, Cesar Chavez was one of the co-founders back in the day in the 70s. The woman who runs it now was a secretary back in the day, and now she runs the whole thing. And what they do is that they go out into the fields, right? And they take people out of the fields, right? So, you go into a strawberry field and you say, do you have papers? Are you here legally? That person will say, yeah, I'm here legally. Okay, stop doing this. Come to our center, we're gonna train you, right? We're gonna train you to do something else, right? So, electrician or computer repair or whatever. And then for 9 months, they train these people to learn a skill. Now, this program is funded, or now currently is funded. I don't know what's going to happen, if something bad happens in the elections, but it's currently funded through the farm worker initiative that somebody in the 1970s kind of laid out. And one of the things that we do at CET is that we always ask, whenever we go to lobby in Washington, D.C. for some reason, we always take a couple of them with us, a couple of these students, right? And they're in their 40s, 50s, they work their entire lives in the fields. Now they know how to fix a light bulb, fix the electricity or something. And we take them, we fly them out to Washington, D.C., and as we're going office to office talking to the senators, we don't even say anything, we let them talk, right? In Spanish even, like, just tell the senator everything about yourself and what you're doing now. And it works, it works. They have, Bush didn't defund the program, the other Bush didn't do it, Reagan didn't do it, so it's these personal narratives that have a lot of political clout. Because if I were to go, I'm a professor of philosophy, and you need to keep this program alive, they have brushed me aside. I'll talk to you. So.
I found another example when you're speaking of the narrative function, but it's a different context, and it's a different. It's still personal narrative. Is Steven Spielberg? He's a documentary documenting the personal narratives of the Holocaust survivors and creating a repository of those stories.
Right.
I don't know what they're going to be used for, or if they're going to be publicly accessible, where they're going to be stored.
Right.
I don't know if they're all standardized 10-minute stories or 20-minute stories, whatever people want. But that's the whole another example of the personal story.
Right. Yeah, I mean it's and like with immigrant stories, with immigrant narratives, I think that we really get a good sense of a good sense of what it is to be in this country. What it means to be an American, as I like to say. I was telling Gabe and the story of how my father he bought a house in 1997 after many years of living in garages and rentals and stuff, and he finally bought a house in 1997. And it turns out that the exact location of the kitchen, right, of that house is the exact spot where in 1972 he was captured by the Immigrant and sent back to Mexico, right? So he bought a house at the place where he was taken from, where he was captured. And he's very proud of that, And what does that say about the American way of our own possibilities, And so, but I don't like to say that. I think that my father said the story is one of constant return. Like he just wants to go back. He's been here since the 1970s. He wants to go back. So right now he's over there in Mexico, and I'm having a really hard time getting him to come back because he just doesn't want to. He just wants to be there, So yeah. Yes.
Hey, one thing I heard in the way you told your father's story was that people's dependence on him kept him here. That it's not about the American dream, it's about the relationship of dependence. Which made me start thinking about dependence more generally and everything we've been saying. And one comment you made a moment ago about I don't know why we need them to be illegal, sort of matched up in my mind with, and when we need them, they're allowed here, and when we don't,
Yeah.
we send them out. And I wonder if the illegality is about our dependence, about the way that our form of life, you said this about, that the
Yeah.
citizen is based.
Right.
We get to be the place that people want to come because we made their lives unlivable.
Right.
And so I wonder, I was just trying to think about that sort of dependence, keeping your father here, and lots of relationships of dependence are what keep people in this place. But part of the illegality has to be that our lives can't actually function without these illegal immigrants.
Right.
And part of the disavowal, part of the illegality has to be like a disavowal of that dependence. Or I'm wondering if that's the case.
Yeah, I think so. It's I told the story in my previous talk about Texas Bill 2012. You guys familiar with this bill? Texas Bill 2012. I think it's still going through the legislature. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what happened to it, but it made it illegal in Texas it made it illegal to hire illegal immigrants, and with fines up to like $5,000 or 2 years in prison and $10,000 fine if you hire an illegal immigrant, unless you hire this person to do household work. If you hire this person to do household work, then you were free to hire them. And then I had a quote that this Texas representative was trying to justify this, and he said without the exemption, a large segment of the Texas population will wind up in prison. Right? If the bill, if you know, and
Right.
this is the representative. He says, when it comes to household employers or yard workers, it is extremely common for Texans to hire people who are likely undocumented workers. It is so common, it is overlooked. Right? So, you know, they're going to, and I think it passed. I'm not sure, but you know, I talk about it in the other talk how this creates this really thingifies the illegal immigrant to the point where now you can store them in a shed, and bust them out when you need the weeds whacked or something, and that is kind of, they're not illegal, right? But they're not citizens, and they're not, they're there, and you hired them to cut your lawn, so you don't feel so guilty about it or something. Yeah.
And the NAFTA example with the corn growers is a fascinating one too, because I think that like the default conceptual position is to suppose that the border comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have individuals who decide whether they're going to violate the law and cross the border, and they exist outside the law, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
When in the case of NAFTA, you have corn growers in Mexico whose livelihood basically was stripped from them because of geopolitical decisions they had nothing to do with. And so, we move the border, in essence, that they come now to work the crops in the U.S. because of economic necessity.
Yeah, that's the corn thing is fascinating to me, really. Especially once I ran into that Rorty quote, about the raising of the temples, and there is an actual temple to the god of maize, to the corn god. So it's that's a temple that was completely raised by geopolitical forces, and now they have to come here. They have no choice.
Well, there's another layer of irony there, is that those corn growers are indigenous people.
Right.
They're native to the Americas. They're Indians.
I have a question about phenomenology.
Yes.
I was reading a book called After Race, and the theorists were arguing that if we're going to use methods like phenomenology to talk about race, we really have to turn it around. Instead of doing a narrative about what it is to be raced, like a lot of race theory does with phenomenology, we have to do a phenomenological description of racism first. And it makes me think of Gabe's question about, if narrative is what's going to get us to the kind of sympathy that Levinas and Ricoeur are describing, which isn't objectified. It is a particularity that's there staring you in the face that you can't just brush off. And I'm wondering about all those narratives that get in the way of that kind of sympathy. So ideological forces that,
Right.
like I can tell myself this story. Yeah, I heard you, but I believe in individualism and liberal theory, so it's a nice story you're telling me. But you should have done something else. You should have grown turnips. You should have whatever. And I'm wondering if your own work might be better applied toward that kind of narrative,
Right.
where you're giving a narrative of the dismissal of the immigrant.
Right.
Like give a narrative account of the phenomenology of dismissal and racism and the generalization of the immigrant.
Yeah.
Like, how do we give a phenomenology of that account instead of just starting with the notion that if we gave narratives we would get around or
Right.
through objectification? It seems like a lot of phenomenology of race stuff goes
Yeah.
that direction.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what you think about that.
I think it's a great idea. Yeah, I mean it's my problem with phenomenology, and I have a lot of problems with phenomenology, and it begins with the fact that I wrote a dissertation on Husserl.
Ah, so that.
And so I started in the wrong foot, I think, you know, because Husserl is not the easiest guy to apply to things like this, you know, because there's scientific objectivity. You want
Right.
things to be, you know, you're looking for essences and stuff like that. And so, you know, the only meaningful thing that I got a lot of meaningful things. The real meaningful thing that I got from Husserl was this idea that we began from the first person. Right?
Yeah.
The first person standpoint, and that's the starting point of any proper description. And I think that the reason why I'm fixated on the narrative aspect of things is because that's what I know. Like I know it, and I'm in constant context of significance, you know.
Guess I'm thinking of the children of Husserl who take the notion of intentionality and go in directions, you know, like Sartre,
Right.
Heidegger, go in directions that are not necessarily distinct from scientific objectivity, but get into the nitty gritty of how my own narrative can get in the way of seeing the other.
Right.
And get in the way of my sympathy. So
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful. I
But-
want to think more about it.
I mean, connected to this, I mean, I don't know if this was your intention, but maybe because you seemed at some point to sort of pit sort of a phenomenological narrative kind of approach against a kind of more ethical, moral-based kind of approach or something like that. I thought I heard you maybe
Yeah.
pit those apart. But one way to explore this issue is just to see how maybe they come together at some point, right? Because, as I say, you're right that we are narrators of our lives, and in that way we are like texts. But then there are other ways in which we're not like texts. For instance, we're people, right? A text is something it's an object, and yeah, it's a narrative, whatever. But I can pick it up or not pick it up, or you know, when I'm confronted by the romance section in the you know, I can ignore it, right? And walk past it because I don't care about romance novels or something, right? Or science fiction or what have you. But when it's a person, you just can't keep walking, right? There's an ethical dimension perhaps
Okay.
about how people, when they meet eye to eye, it's not like meeting a book, right? And so this type of narrative now, the narrative that springs from a person, is one, but perhaps you can't ignore, right, in the same way. And one, perhaps you have some ethical, and maybe this is a phenomenological issue about like how you confront others and all that stuff, right? There's a reciprocity kind of built into the encounter that leaves in abeyance whatever narratives I might have or tastes I may have about what sorts of books I like, what sorts of people I like, right? Because now I'm confronted with a human being that I need to acknowledge as a human being, even if I don't care about romance novels. Maybe this romance novel I have to talk, you know, to sort of put up with, kind of idea.
That's why
And that's maybe an ethical, you know,
Yeah, that's why I was
aspect.
thinking it's a nice move to Levinas there, because
Yeah.
that's where he goes with the face-to-face and the asymmetry.
Right.
And whereas, you know, and there's a lot of discussion about that, like in moral development, moral psychology, you know, the idea of empathy as an egoistic kind of thing. Like, people think of empathy, it's like, well, can I see myself walking in your shoes? And then that's an egoistic,
Right.
what is that leap where I could say, you know, there's no way I could be walking in those shoes? you're an addict, or you're a poor person, or whatever, and there's no way I could see me walking in those
Right.
shoes. And yet there's a way in which I can still make an abstract judgment about the justness or the
Right.
justice or
Right.
fairness of something.
Yeah.
So I know that there's, so I think going to Levinas is one
Yeah.
place, and then there's, in moral psychology, there's also some discussion of developmental issues and empathy.
Right. Well, I'll eventually end up there. Right? I've written a number of papers on this, like this, where I consciously am trying to avoid making it strictly ethical or political or anything like that, simply because of this idea that I have in my head that what I'm doing is kind of is groundwork for that, right? Because I need to say these things, and I'll tell you how I started doing this. I started in a bathroom, right? So here's the story of how I started doing, because this is the fourth paper that I've done on this. I published 2 of them, and then there's these 2, and then I'm thinking of a couple of others that I'm going to write. And I started in a bathroom, and the way it started is I was in the bathroom, and a colleague of mine, he's a poetry professor, and he walks in, and he's a very nice guy. For some reason, we always talk in the bathroom. We always just meet each other in the bathroom. It's the weirdest thing. His name is Samuel Maya, and then we were talking, and then he said, a long time ago, I gave him a poem that I had written, and he really liked it. And he said, have you written any more poems? I said, no, I haven't. He says, it was very good. I like the fact that you're talking about your father, because I got obsessed with my father. And it was a poem about my father, and he said, you should write more about your father. You should write more about that. And I said, I'm thinking of, I have all these stories that I want to tell about my parents and the immigrant experience. It's a bunch of stories that I have. He's like, write them down. Write all these stories down. Give them to me. I know publishers all over the country. We'll publish a book. And then immediately, walking out of the bathroom, I came up with a title. It's called Criminals and Their Children. That was the title of my book. So I started writing all these little short stories down, about my mom, my dad, pesticides. There was a time when pesticide airplane, the guy thought it was going to be funny to spray me with it. Right? So I'm walking to school, and this plane just, and I looked up, and my eyes were burning, and I saw the guy, and he was like, and I was like, what an asshole. And, so I have all these stories of growing up, poor and as an immigrant, basically. And all of a sudden, I started to think about the fact that, I had lived that life, right? And so I wrote that paper that I presented in the Society for Philosophy in the Contemporary World, called Philosophy and the Post-Immigrant Fear, where I talked about how I was this post-immigrant, but I suffered from this fear of being a philosopher. Okay? That somehow I was going to say something that was going to get me kicked out. Right? I have this immigrant, fear that if I say something weird about Husserl, you're going to call that Husserlian circle, and they're going to kick me out of the philosophy.
Take your certificate away.
Yeah, they're going to take my card away, and so that's, to me, that paper was very phenomenological. So then I continued on with that move, and I started talking about the force of the papers, right? Your green card, what makes you what gives you legality, what gives you the status, right? So I call that one Documents and Subjectivity, and it's about how these documents kind of fill you with a sense of self. And when I go to my dad's house, he has them all his green cards. He has that have expired. He has them all in this big old frame, right? I talked to other friends of mine who went through similar experiences, and you have to pry these papers out of their cold dead hands before they misplace them or let you have them for whatever reason, And so the direction that I'm going with all these papers is one where I really want to set this, just to me, what I consider to be this groundwork of stuff that eventually will get me to talk about ethics, politics, and stuff. and then eventually I'll finish my book, and then you can read the book, see where it started.
Other questions people have? Well, let's thank our speaker.
Thank you very much, everybody. This was wonderful. I had a wonderful experience both this morning and right now, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
I feel very, very, very happy that I did this. Awesome. Thank you.